Hello, welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. My name is Stephen Meyer, and today I'm going to be presenting, this is sort of the first of a three-part presentation based on my essay entitled When to Retain the Group Name, Defining and Applying the Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple Paradigms. I encourage everybody to hit the link below to perhaps read the text version of my essay if you sort of want a more complete view of the arguments I'm trying to make. But what I've done with this particular essay is I've broken it up into three YouTube presentations. Essentially, what I'm looking at in this essay is relates to a discussion that heavy metal and hard rock people seem to have all the time, really. In other words, when is it appropriate for a band, say a longtime established band perhaps, to continue on with their name even when key members have left, right? So that's something that gets discussed quite a bit. And my essay is broken up into three parts. The first part is really, again, sort of introducing this argument and introducing it in light of this Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple sort of model or paradigm. And the reason I'm calling it that is because I think Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple are at the extremes of this argument in some respects. Led Zeppelin's an example of a long-established band that only carried on as long as their original four members were available, right? Whereas Deep Purple is at the other extreme. The Deep Purple name has existed since 1968, and it's still going today. And that moniker has been reasonably continuous throughout all these decades in spite of many, many, many lineup changes, right? So I'm sort of presenting both as models, the Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple model, and then we'll see most bands sort of fit in between. In the second YouTube presentation, or I guess the second third of the essay, I present or suggest, I guess, my own framework in sort of my own humble sort of way, how I think we could be more objective about this, that I think there is a framework we could follow that allows us to understand as fans, I suppose, when it is justifiable that a band carried on with their name, and other times when in fact it probably would have been, more justifiable for the band to maybe call themselves something else. So did it make sense for Uriah Heep to carry on with Uriah Heep for all the years? Did it make sense for Black Sabbath to do that, for Deep Purple, et cetera, et cetera? And we're going to see with this framework I've developed that it becomes a little clearer which bands, it makes sense for them to carry on, and for which bands it's maybe harder to defend the use of that name for so many years, given the nature of the lineup changes. And then in the third part, the last third of the essay, once I've sort of established what this framework is, then we apply it to many well-known bands and look at their situation. So again, bands that I specifically look at in this essay, I do apply, say, to this Led Zeppelin Deep Purple paradigm and this framework that I develop. I don't know if it's particularly unique, but I haven't seen anybody else do this, to bands like Kiss, to Venom, to Megadeth, etc. Okay, so here in the first part, we're going to sort of introduce the argument and talk about what do I mean by the Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple paradigms. So if we sort of follow along with my essay, again, you can download this for free if you choose to read the text. So membership changes and the impact on the group label. So heavy metal and hard rock attracts a very loyal number of appreciators, perhaps more so than any other form of music, right? And that probably, the loyalty that we have as metal fans and hard rock fans, that's probably why this discussion always seems to be such a big deal, that we talk a lot about and we compare different lineups when key members leave, because this seems to matter so much to us. And so I'm sure, as fans yourselves, you've probably all had discussions with friends, or maybe just thought about it yourself, comparing a band's replacement versus their predecessor. How many times have you had the Ozzy Dio argument in Black Sabbath, which lineup you like better, et cetera? The David Lee Roth, Sammy Hagar discussion. Was it still truly Van Halen when David Lee Roth left the band? How many people still talk about that? Or the Bon Scott versus Brian Johnson discussions when it relates to AC/DC. I mean, certainly these would be three of the highest profile, I think, replacements that heavy metal fans, hard rock fans have discussed. But it's not, you know, these discussions are not just limited to the most high profile. I mean, replacements can cause considerable discussions amongst supporters of more, you might say, more niche oriented acts. I mean, lots of people will discuss the merits of replacing Dave Lombardo with Paul Bostoff in Slayer, right? The Vincent Tucker debate when it comes to Morbid Angel. For fans of Dream Theater, you know, is it still Dream Theater without Mike Portnoy? And, you know, so Portnoy versus Mangini at the drumming position. I mean, also very controversial is Sepultura, the Cavalera Green sort of controversy, if you like. Even in Immortal, I get much more of a fringe act, I guess, a black metal band. But I mean, do you consider Immortal still Immortal without a bat, for instance? Or without Demonaz, or do they both have to be in the band, et cetera? So, I mean, these are discussions you see all the time. For you Ramones fans out there, you know, was the shift away from Dee Dee to CJ, was that significant enough that maybe the Ramones were never quite the same after that? Or are you okay with them carrying on as the Ramones without Dee Dee, you know, et cetera? So these are things that hard rock, heavy metal, punk fans, et cetera, debate all the time, right? And so when groups do switch musicians, immediate reverberations echo through the fan base almost immediately. So when we do have a significant shift, there's a whole lot of talk about it initially, and especially related to the next album with the replacement. So we'll talk about that a whole lot. And of course, the musicians have to spend a lot of time defending their decisions, you know, to replace maybe a really popular member. Or the member leaving will justify perhaps why they had to go and all that. So it takes up a lot of air, a lot of oxygen when these things happen. And this debate about replacements can ebb and flow through time, right? Lots of times, you know, as new generation of fans discover these amazing groups, you know, the debate can spark up all over again. I mean, there might be new hard rock fans that, you know, were never around when Bon Scott was the lead singer of AC/DC, and all they've really known is Brian Johnson. But as they dig deeper into AC/DC and they check out the Bon Scott stuff, then they kind of have that debate too. Okay, which lineup resonates the most with me, and that sort of thing. So, in short, to metal and hard rock fans, this is always a big deal to us when key members leave, and how justifiable it is for a band to continue on when especially really popular member leaves, etc. But the essence and indeed the ferocity of any group membership debate always centers on the band label, right? And again, that's always where the controversy comes in if you kind of just try to boil this down a little bit. If the band retires their name after a significant member leaves, you don't really have any controversy, right? So just for example, say if Black Sabbath called itself something else when Ozzy left or was fired, depending on your point of view, in 1979, there wouldn't have been near the controversy or near the debate, right? So when Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward joined forces with Ronnie James Dio, right? I don't think we'd have had near the controversy that we had when, in fact, Ozzy was replaced by Dio and Sabbath continued on as Black Sabbath, right? I mean, no question we would have compared. I mean, because when we talk about Dio and Ozzy, we're talking about two of the greatest frontmen of all time, right? So of course we're going to compare. But I don't think there would have been, as much vigor in the debate. And indeed, at times it was quite mean-spirited, like the Ozzy versus the Dio side. And even the bands themselves were, really at times really quite mean about things at times, right? And I'm convinced that if it really came down to not just that Ozzy left Black Sabbath, I mean, that was a big enough blow as it is, but that Black Sabbath chose or had the audacity, depending on your point of view, to continue on as Black Sabbath without Ozzy, right? It's because Sabbath carried on with the name that I think that's what fueled the fire of this debate so much, right? And it didn't matter that the first album out of the gate, Heaven and Hell, was like an amazing piece of music. Almost everybody will recognize this as a classic album. It didn't matter that Dio is considered one of the greatest vocalists in all time of heavy music. Some would put him right at the top. right? None of this mattered. It still was very much that there was a significant number of people that sure, Dio won a lot of fans over too, of course, but there was still a significant number of people, basically no Ozzy, no Sabbath, right? And there's I don't want to hear anything else kind of thing, right? But again, it really came down to, it might seem simple, but it's incredibly significant, the fact that the name continued without Ozzy, right? I mean, just compare that to, nobody had made a big fuss when Ozzy Osbourne formed his own band, right? And was initially called Blizzard of Oz, right? In fact, most people, I think, were happy that that happened, you know? I mean, probably most people at the time would have wished, you know, Ozzy would have stayed in Sabbath, but once it was clear that wasn't going to work, I think everybody was happy to hear, okay, Ozzy's going to give us some new music, right? And forming the band around Randy Rhoads and Bob Daisley and Lee Kerslake, I mean, there was no controversy to that, right? I would say not at all. The controversy all stayed on the Sabbath side, you know, by carrying on with the name and then inevitably comparing Ozzy and Dio, which kind of went on forever and probably always will. I mean, we can say it's the same sort of thing about when Ritchie Blackmore formed Rainbow in 1975, right? I don't think anybody had a problem that Blackmore formed a new band. Again, I would say it's the same thing. I think most people were very happy that Ritchie formed a new band once it was clear he was no longer comfortable in Deep Purple, right? All of the controversy was centered on Deep Purple, right? That Deep Purple continued on without Blackmore and replaced him with Tommy Bolin, a pretty amazing guitar player in his own right. But that did not stop people from screaming, again, no Blackmore, no Purple kind of thing. And it was all because Deep Purple carried on with the name. If Deep Purple would have been called something else with Tommy Bolin, I doubt we'd have had near the controversy. You always would have comparisons, but it wouldn't have been near the controversy, right? So it's all about the name. Whereas Rainbow, no controversy at all, right? In fact, I think it was welcome. Okay, so I think you sort of get what I'm trying to say there. So when famous or infamous members form new groups, they have to build a fresh reputation, both creatively and commercially, right? So again, they don't have the benefit of that big name to back them up. They got to start fresh in a lot of ways, right? So there's, you know, that's a bit of a challenge. But then they also have the opportunity to leave a lot of the baggage behind. That baggage tends to stay with the old band. They're the ones that usually have to do most of the justifying of why we replaced this person, you know, why we're carrying on with the name and all that sort of stuff, right? And again, going back to Black Sabbath, I'm sure most of you know this, it's pretty much common knowledge, but Tony Iommi took a lot of criticism and a lot of heat for carrying on with the Black Sabbath name. I mean, well beyond the Dio situation, there were a number of albums where Tony was the only original member in Black Sabbath, and he carried on with a number of albums, right? Seventh Star, Tear, Headless Cross. He's the only original member on those albums, right? And he took a lot of criticism, a lot of ridicule too, which was, as a big fan of Iommi, it was actually kind of hard to watch. And I would argue really a pity too, because the music, call it what you want, Sabbath, Iommi, whatever, the music to me was still top notch, but I don't think it ever got a fair shake. Like those albums, I don't think ever got a fair shake because there were so many people who just couldn't get past the fact that how dare you keep calling this Black Sabbath, and really didn't give the music a fair chance, I think, as a result, right? For what it's worth, and I'll, you know, a bit of a spoiler alert here, I suppose, once I get the framework done, et cetera, you'll see though, in my view, and I'm going to try to justify this view later on in the essay, but I think any configuration that contained Tony Iommi was justifiably Black Sabbath, right? That's my view. So I have no problem with him calling it Black Sabbath because, again, and for reasons that I will justify later on. I'm not that liberal with every case. There's a lot of cases where I'll explain that as well. There's other bands who I think it's harder to justify how that they carried on with the name, but it depends on the circumstances. And that's what this framework I'm going to develop will hopefully make clear. Okay. So as I said, I'm in trying to frame this debate, if you like, I'm sort of considering this from two extremes. So you've got on one hand, the Led Zeppelin example of how to handle group membership change, and the Deep Purple example on how to handle group membership change, right? And to me, they're at opposite ends. They're polar opposites here. So starting with Zeppelin, And again, I'm not going to go through big histories of both of these bands because, again, it would take forever to do that. And there's all kinds of other websites and sources that'll do that for you. What I'm going to do, though, I will talk a little bit about the histories of these bands in light of membership changes because it's sort of central to the arguments I'm trying to make here. So Zeppelin provides an excellent example of a legendary hard rock band that, if you like, has remained in its purest form throughout its existence, right? Which technically goes from 1968 to even today. And I say today because Led Zeppelin still is out there. People still listen to their albums. They still reissue albums, right? I mean, Jimmy Page has been really active in, deluxe versions and remastering and all that sort of stuff. And of course, the group still enjoys a massive following. It's still one of the biggest bands on the planet, really. But here's the point, though. But effectively, the group's touring and recording days ended after 1979. After In Through the Outdoor, that Zeppelin ceased to be a going concern in terms of new material and touring, right? So everything since then has either been a reissue or a compilation, and there have been no tours. And Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, and John Paul Jones have been steadfast in their belief that essentially the group ceased to be a going concern after John Bonham died in 1980. The "it won't work without Bonham" argument has been the most consistent answer all three of the surviving members of Led Zeppelin have given as to why there's been no reunion tours or no new music from the band. Although it is widely believed that if Robert Plant would ever agreed to it, the others probably would have too. But anyway, there's only been one exception so far to this. And it was a one-off live performance in 2007 at the O2 Arena in London, in which Jason Bonham, John's son, substituted for his father on drums. So but it was only just this one time. Wasn't a tour, no new music, right? It was just a one-off kind of thing. Okay, so let me state the obvious, because I don't want to diminish the importance of Bonzo. He is, one of the greatest drummers to ever live in hard rock, of his era or any era, right? So I'm not diminishing Bonzo. I love Bonzo. I think I could talk about him all day. But in the context of Led Zeppelin, he would have been the easiest to replace, right? Should they have chosen to do that, which they didn't, but he would have been the easiest to replace. Okay. In hard rock and heavy metal, whether this is, for rightly or wrongly, it's the lead singers and the lead guitarists that usually get disproportionate status, right? And they're also typically most highly associated with a group's identity. So again, when we're trying to talk about, should groups continue, et cetera, lots of people associate most strongly in hard rock and heavy metal with the lead singers and the lead guitarists. By comparison, drummers, bass players, and maybe to some extent rhythm guitarists, keyboard players, et cetera, are often considered, and again, I'm not saying this is fair, but often the perception is they're more in supportive roles, if we can put it that way, right? Sometimes incredibly significant, but arguably, easier to replace, or at least there's a whole lot less controversy when those positions are replaced as opposed to, say, the lead singer or the lead guitarist. The key exception would be is if one of the musicians in these more supportive roles, if you want to put it that way, was an essential writer, right? In which case, his or her contribution would probably be elevated in the eyes of the fans. So again, talking about Zeppelin, John Paul Jones would be a good example of that. He would, bass player, I guess that was his primary role, if you want to look at it that, but he also was a really important songwriter in Led Zeppelin. Yes, probably the lion's share of Led Zeppelin was written, was Page and Plant. But if you look at the writing credits, there's a whole lot of John Paul Jones in there as well. Plus, he was a multi-instrumentalist, right? He played keyboards and Hammond organ and lots of different things. And in some songs for Led Zeppelin, that was pretty important to their sound, right? You contrast that with John Bonham, and John Bonham was credited with writing really very little. He was not a writer in Led Zeppelin to any degree. And holding constant, yes, he was very flamboyant off the stage as well, right? But at the end of the day, he was only a drummer, albeit an incredibly great one, right? So again, all things equal, he would have been the one they probably could have replaced with the least amount of fuss. And particularly since he died, like it's not like it kicked him out of the band. That I think that might have something that also I think could affect the argument as well, right? But nevertheless, Zeppelin stayed in their purest form, and Bonham was never replaced, and Led Zeppelin, at least except for that one night, had ceased to be an ongoing concern after Bonham was no longer available. Okay, as it turns out, so that's sort of the Led Zeppelin example, right? Maybe that in the purest form in some ways, that only the original members can make up the original band name, if you like. As soon as you lose one original member, it's over, or you got to call it something else or whatever. But as it turns out, there are really not that many hard rock and metal bands that have been around for a while that follow the Zeppelin paradigm, right? And that seems to bother a lot of people, right? It only takes a brief examination of comments in various chat environments. I'm sure you guys have all seen these things to understand that there are many fans who champion the idea that the group should only exist as long as original members are intact. So there's a lot of people, although it doesn't happen that often, but it seems like there's a lot of fans out there that really kind of like this approach, that in their mind, it's all about the original members, right? So these would be people, again, you might call them purists. Often some people refer to them as such. And of course, these would be people who really can't stand the idea of Pink Floyd without Roger Waters. Maybe you're one of those people, right? Of course, you won't accept Black Sabbath without Ozzy, and probably without Bill Ward too. And there were lots of people, Ozzy, of course, more high profile, but when Black Sabbath did reunite as Black Sabbath with Geezer Butler, Tony Iommi, and Ozzy Osbourne for 13, and then a couple tours around 13, there was no Bill Ward. And there was lots of people that were not happy about that. I read it many times with fans' comments saying no Ward, no Bill Ward, no Black Sabbath, right? So again, there's lots of folks out there that think this way. And if you do, cool. I mean, I'm certainly not saying you're wrong or anything. These would be people, again, who won't, have a real problem with Kiss carrying on without Ace Frehley, right? And probably Peter Criss as well. I think probably I hear more about Ace, but both, right? You can't be Kiss without Ace and Peter, maybe especially Ace. And they're all over the fact that they applaud bands, although they're very few. They applaud bands like ZZ Top, who essentially have followed the Zeppelin model. Although ZZ Top, I mean, at the point of writing this, sadly, Dusty Hill, the longtime bass player, died just recently. And I think what's been put out in the press is that ZZ is going to continue, at least in the near future, I guess, just to honor, tour dates. Now, again, will they continue after the tour, and will they put out new music without Dusty? We don't know. But up until very recently, ZZ Top was one of the few big bands that's been around a long time that's followed the Zeppelin model. So like I say, it's actually fairly rare. But even though it's rare, even though the Zeppelin approach is rare, that doesn't stop a lot of fans for wishing more bands would take that approach, it seems. Okay. All right. But of course, too, and I'll mention just really quickly, certainly while there's a lot of fans who might prefer the Zeppelin model, anybody who's involved with these bands from a financial standpoint would hate this, right? I mean, the name means money, especially for big bands, right? I mean, you'll make X amount of dollars if you go out as Robert Plant. And let's face it, Robert Plant had a really successful solo career, as did to a lesser degree Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones. But money-wise, it would be completely dwarfed if Zeppelin ever would agree to reform and do tours and new albums again. It would probably be the biggest thing. It would be. It would be the biggest thing in music. I don't think there's any question. Right. So if you're looking at this from purely a financial standpoint, I'm sure there's a lot of bean counters out there. They're very happy that most bands will carry on with the moniker. In fact, very often the ones pressuring artists to keep the old name because it makes money. Doesn't mean, though, that they should. Okay. So that's Zeppelin. Deep Purple, I think, again, a fair comparison with Led Zeppelin, because Deep Purple also started in the late 60s. They were contemporaries of Zeppelin. They played a progressive, diverse style of mostly hard rock, as Zeppelin did. They both British bands. And again, while some people might not realize this, I mean, most people realize how popular Led Zeppelin was and is. But Deep Purple, especially in the early 70s, they were as big a band as Led Zeppelin, I think. And there was, I think, a few years in the 70s where they were probably the biggest band on the planet. So they were peers of Led Zeppelin. However, in terms of group membership stability, Deep Purple really couldn't be any different than Zeppelin. So there's a lot of similarities, and that's why I think they're fair comparisons. But when it comes to how they approach group membership and the continuation of the group name, completely the opposite of Zeppelin, right? There have been 7 different recording lineup changes under the Deep Purple moniker. And group changes have occurred at every position, except for Ian Pace, the amazing Ian Pace on drums. He is the only member of Deep Purple that's on every Deep Purple album, right? The only one. I mean, again, same with Zeppelin. You can look up more information about the various lineups in Deep Purple. Again, it would take me kind of all day if I was going to go into this real deep, but I'm going to give you sort of an overview of it, again, in line of what my focus is here in this essay. So again, while there's been a lot of lineup changes, these have not been trivial lineup changes. All right. I mean, we've had numerous changes at the lead guitar position, at the lead vocal position, keyboards. I mean, on it goes. And some of the greatest musicians to ever play hard rock were featured at some point within Deep Purple. That's not exaggeration. In fact, that people who are hard rock fans will pretty much just take this on fact, right? The musicianship that's been through the Deep Purple ranks is astonishing, right? Ritchie Blackmore, John Lord, Steve Morse, Tommy Bolin, Ian Gillan, David Coverdale, Glenn Hughes, Roger Glover, Don Airey, boom, 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 on and on and on. Monsters one and all as musicians. This is not even in dispute, I think, with most people. All of these guys are absolute top-notch, top of their game players, right? But what is far more disputed is the appropriateness of referring to some or all of these amazing players as Deep Purple. And relatedly, for those who do not accept some or any of these changes that Deep Purple has made over the years, there's always been debate at what point did Deep Purple effectively become Deep Purple only in name and not really in music? So if you're the type of person that doesn't accept all of these changes that Deep Purple, the name should have continued, well, then at what point in time does Deep Purple kind of stop being Deep Purple? So where do you draw the line, essentially? Because we're not just talking a couple lineups, we're talking many, right? Okay, so let's dig into this a little more. I don't think it's controversial to say at all that for most, if not the majority of Deep Purple fans, or just hard rock fans in general, it's Mark II. Purple is often, the various lineups are usually defined in terms of Mark. Mark II is the classic, and some will go further than saying it's the classic Deep Purple. It's the real Deep Purple, or some will say it's really the only Deep Purple for some. Okay, I don't know if I'd go that far, but there is no question that the Blackmore, Gillan, Glover, Lord, and Pace, so like guitar, vocals, bass, keyboards, and drums respectively, that lineup produced the bulk of the band's best-known songs and enjoyed the most commercial success. Okay, that's indisputable, right? Deep Purple's most popular songs came from Mark II, no question. And they also enjoyed the most commercial success, unquestioned, right? Again, that was especially in the 70s, where they were Zeppelin's peers, but also when they reformed in the 1980s too, at least initially, they had a lot of success then too. And I think also importantly, it was Mark II that was largely responsible for building the legendary live improv skills that really, I think, Deep Purple is unmatched in the history of hard rock. Deep Purple's ability to sort of make up things on the fly live was, to me, they were peerless. Like for many people, there are truly two different, Deep Purple is sort of two different animals, really all the lineups, but there's a studio Deep Purple and there's a live Deep Purple, and the two are really quite different. And again, Deep Purple's ability to sort of take a song and take it wherever it might go, and it's different every night, was, like I say, I don't think anybody in hard rock did it better. And that improv ability of Deep Purple is most closely associated with Mark II. And a lot of that really comes down to Blackmore and Lord, I think. But the whole band was just magicians at that, right? And I think it's that lineup that, although I'm not, they were doing it in Mark I too, but I think in Mark II is where they really bring it home. And I think that's where the reputation was built, on this improv sort of thing, right? Okay. So a lot of people then, Mark II is the one that people know. Machine Head, everybody knows Machine Head. Machine Head, is the one album that perhaps is more popular than it probably should be, because in some ways it eclipses other amazing material. But nevertheless, a lot of people will know, Machine Head. Most people are going to know In Rock. Fireball, maybe less so, but again, anything Mark II did, a lot of people will know. Made in Japan, one of the more famous live albums, that's going to be known, right? And then that might be all they know of Deep Purple, right? Like, it's that Mark II that kind of tends to eclipse a lot of the other lineups. Actually, I feel sorry for folks that if that's the only lineup they know, you should check out some of the others, because you're missing out on some amazing music. But anyway, a couple of things we got to keep in mind, though. I mean, it's indisputable that Mark II was the most well-known version of Deep Purple and the most commercially successful, et cetera, built the improv, all that stuff. But we got to remember, Mark II wasn't Mark I. So this is not the original lineup, right? That lineup that made all these well-known albums and et cetera, was not the original lineup. Rod Evans and Nick Simper were the original vocalist and bass player, respectively, in Deep Purple, right? And this does matter, because you can't just, some people do this, but not too many. And you can't just sort of ignore Mark I and say, well, it was just some kind of embryo that doesn't really matter, and Deep Purple doesn't arrive until In Rock. I don't think you can make that comment at all. Mark I had a fair amount of success, couple big hits, actually, Hush being a good example. And there's lots of people even today that will look back on that era and say that was an amazing, amazing group, that Mark I, right? And quite critically acclaimed for its time too. So again, I don't think you can just sort of brush off Mark I and say, well, it doesn't matter. Okay, they're not the original lineup, but it's Mark II that, no, they were of consequence, right? And then when Mark II fractured after Who Do We Think We Are? And of course, Ian Gillan and Roger Glover are replaced by, David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes. And again, it's not like there was this massive fall off of Deep Purple, whether it be commercial or popularity or even in critical acclaim. I mean, Burn was incredibly well received. Even though the band, yes, there's Deep Purple it definitely has a different flavor with David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes in the band, but it's not like it sort of fell off the planet, right? Mark III was an incredibly successful lineup as well. Now, I'd say it's harder to sort of gauge where a lot of people are at this time. I think it's safe to say most people were still willing to call it Deep Purple when you had Glenn Hughes and David Coverdale in the band. I think most people, so that had been the Burn, Stormbringer sort of era of the band, Mark III, right? Not everybody. There were people already grumbling, well, is this really Deep Purple? But I think the consensus would be more or less that most people are still willing to call it Deep Purple at that point. Where things start to get a lot hairier is when Richie Blackmore leaves. And you get to Mark IV, where Tommy Bolin replaces Blackmore. Now I think you've got a pretty serious divide in the Deep Purple camp. I mean, I'm talking about the fans, where there'd be a number of people saying, well, this isn't really Deep Purple now, right? I mean, Blackmore was just so, and certainly it was the era of the guitar hero too, big time. So Blackmore had a lot of weight, not only being the lead guitar player, but one of the key writers. And I mean, Richie was just so well loved too. So that had a lot to do with it. And there were a lot of people that know Blackmore nor Purple out there, right? And even John Lord and Ian Pace, sort of after the fact, have been quoted as saying, we might have been better off winding it up when Richie left, I don't think that was meant as a shot at Come Taste the Band, which is an incredible album, but more so that Tommy Bolin sadly had a lot of personal and drug problems and died soon after anyway. So But that's where things start to get more controversial. So I think we're on a bit of a slope here, right? That a lot of people will, okay, the real Deep Purple is Mark II. Certainly it's the classic era, right? Okay, I'm not sure how you reconcile the idea that you still got Mark I. They're not original members, but I mean, and then you get to Mark III. Most people are probably okay still calling it Deep Purple because you still got Ritchie in the band, even though you've got Coverdale and Glenn Hughes in there. But by the time you get to Mark IV, now you've got a lot more controversy. Is this still really Deep Purple? Should they still be calling it Deep Purple? And like I say, even some of the band members weren't so sure that that was the right thing to do. So that it becomes a lot more controversial. Even though Come Taste the Band's an amazing album, okay, I'm not knocking it, but should it have been called Deep Purple? I guess becomes the question. Okay, so Deep Purple kind of retires. The name retires it for a few years, right? After Come Taste the Band. But then they reform. And of course, they reform with Mark II. So they released Perfect Strangers in 1984. Well, there's nobody on the planet that has a problem with them calling themselves Deep Purple, right? Because again, it's Mark II. It's the one that most people know, et cetera, et cetera. So they're fine there. And they released Perfect Strangers, as I said. House of the Blue Light comes out in 1987. Two really great albums as far as I'm concerned. But then things start to get a little weird again, as they tend to in Deep Purple, at least around this time. So Gillan gets kicked out of the band after House of the Blue Light, and he gets replaced by Joe Lynn Turner. And we get now we're up to Mark V, and we get the release of Slaves and Masters, and there was a tour, et cetera. Now, as a lot of people will know, Joe Lynn Turner, pretty great singer in his own right, had played with Ritchie Blackmore in Rainbow. He's on 3 studio Rainbow albums, right? And given the fact that Roger Glover actually did a fair amount of time in Rainbow too, there was a lot of people saying, well, you know what, this is as much Rainbow as Deep Purple, so I'm not even sure we should be calling this Deep Purple, right? So quite a bit of controversy there. But then Joe Lynn Turner era doesn't last very long, and then we get a reform of Mark II yet again. Ian Gillan comes back for The Battle Rages On, another very underrated album, I would say. But this time Mark II doesn't stay together very long at all. They don't even make it to the tour, actually. And then Ritchie leaves, Blackmore leaves for the last time. Or at least he's never been back since. Okay, so now we move into another very controversial era. And the 2 most recent configurations of the band, now we're at Mark VI and Mark VII, right? Oh, and I guess I should say, some people even say there's a Mark VIII because Joe Satriani was actually in Deep Purple. And yes, that Joe was actually in Deep Purple for a short period of time. I'm not calling it a mark because he never did any recording, but he did. When Blackmore left fairly abruptly, Joe did finish the tour. I think it was just in Japan. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think it was just dates in Japan. But Joe was the lead guitarist of Deep Purple. I always wonder what a studio album would have sounded like with Joe Satriani. You can wonder about that. But hey, the replacement they got in Steve Morris, wow, as far as I'm concerned. And then later on, Don Airey, right? Don Airey replaces John Lord. So that gives you your Mark VI and your Mark VII, right? But again, this is controversial to a lot of people. A lot of people don't recognize Mark VI or Mark VII as truly Deep Purple, even though, of course, they continue to call themselves Deep Purple. And these are long-time lineups, right? Steve Morris has now been on 7 Deep Purple albums, and Don Airey's been on 5. Okay, so really, Ritchie Blackmore and John Lord have been gone from the band for quite some time. But that doesn't stop people from basically saying, well, without Ritchie and John, it's not Deep Purple, and I don't recognize this lineup, and on it goes. Even though it still has Gillan, Glover, and Pace. Mind you, only one original member. Only Ian Pace remains from the original Mark I lineup. Okay, so quite a bit of controversy at many points here for Deep Purple for a lot of people. Mark IV, when Tommy Bolin replaces Ritchie, right? The Joe Lynn Turner era, I think, is controversial for a lot of people. And then also both the Steve Morris and the Don Airey eras are also controversial for some people. Of course, a byproduct from this Deep Purple, all these changes that we didn't get with Led Zeppelin, but we got with Deep Purple and the Deep Purple paradigm, is that we got a lot of incredible offshoots Deep Purple offshoots, right? Like, again, Rainbow, Gillan, Whitesnake, all kinds of great bands that were sort of offshoots from the mothership of Deep Purple. So kind of a bonus in a lot of ways for fans. We obviously didn't get any of these windfalls from Led Zeppelin because there were no Led Zeppelin offshoots to speak of because, other than solo careers, of course, right? I mean, I guess you could count that, right? But Zeppelin didn't have, because you didn't have near the changes and replacements, you didn't have the same number of offshoots. So I guess it's a bit of a windfall depending on how you look at it. But anyway, okay, so here's the issue with the debate, and this is sort of what brings me to why I think it's appropriate to come up with some sort of framework here. And I'm going to stick with the Deep Purple paradigm, the Deep Purple model to sort of describe this. Because I think here's a few questions that are worth pondering, especially for people who really only consider Mark II as the real Deep Purple, right? And if you do, fine. I'm not saying you're wrong. Your opinion is certainly as good as mine, probably better in a lot of ways. So I'm not saying you're wrong, but I think there's a lot of inconsistencies with that argument. And I think there's also a whole lot of subjectivity that I think we can do better. And that's where I think my framework comes in, which I'll get to. But here are some of the questions I have for folks that consider Mark II the real Deep Purple. So I've already stated this, so I won't go on too much about this. But if you're that type of person, if you think Mark II, so, Blackmore, Lord, Gillan, Glover, Pace, if you think that's the real Deep Purple or the only valid Deep Purple, how do you reconcile the fact that Gillan and Glover are not original members? So again, I'm not sure how you square that circle. I can see, if you're the purist, if you're kind of taking the Zeppelin model, then you'll only accept the band carrying on with the name if it's original members. Okay, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with that in most cases, but at least it's a consistent view, right? But you can't even really say that if you're saying Mark II is the real Deep Purple because they're not original members. So I'm not sure how you square that circle. Okay. Do you hold this view, if you are the type of person who thinks Mark II is the only one that's valid? Do you hold this view because this lineup sold the most or simply because you like them best? Well, okay, the sell the most part, I guess you can measure that. So that is a little more objective. But if you simply because you like them best, again, that's fine. We all have our favorites, and I'm sure not trying to tell anybody what they should like best. That would be ludicrous, right? But does that just because you like a lineup best, does that justify a view that the others are somehow less valid? Okay. And I think if people are being really honest with themselves, I think sometimes that's what they're saying, right? I don't think the others are valid because I just don't like them as well. Well, okay, you don't have to like, you like what you like. That's fair enough. But that doesn't make the other lineups less valid just because you don't like them as much, right? Okay, and related to commercial success, yes, Mark II, undisputedly the most commercially successful. Is that a fair measure of retaining a group's moniker anyway? Well, I'm going to argue it is not, right? That to a large, if you're only going to look at sales of albums or tours, yeah, okay, it's a factor, but I don't think that should be the overriding reason why a band continues on with their name, even though, as I said before, that often is a big part of the pressure to keep the name because you will, inevitably, it'll mean more money if you do. But I'm not sure that justifies anything, really. And again, I'll get to why later on. Okay, so here's where it gets even more subjective and harder to measure, I think. But I think this is implied by people who only accept, say, one lineup as the only lineup, so to speak. What is the true Deep Purple sound anyway? And how can one objectively defend that this is disproportionately dependent on, say, Blackmore's guitar and Gillan's voice? So that all-important lead guitar and lead vocalist position, right? I think people, when they're saying things like this is the only lineup that matters, it's in effect what they're saying is this is the true Deep Purple sound, or this is the true sound of the band, okay? Again, I'm not sure how that can really be measured because that's very much ear of the beholder, I think, in many ways, when you're just listening to it and say, okay, that's Deep Purple. But this, what Steve Morse is doing, well, I'm sorry, that's not Deep Purple. That's very subjective, all right? That might be true for some people, but not for everybody. So again, I'm not really sure that we can objectively say what the true Deep Purple sound is, right? I mean, in my point of view, I think Highway Star and I think Burn is every much the Deep Purple sound as Highway Star is, or as Mandrake Root is, right? That all sounds like Deep Purple to me, or Ted the Mechanic, right? This is all, but others no, it would just the highway star. That's it. And, you know, so again, but I'm not really, but again, I'm not the authority here. I don't think anybody is. I'm just saying it's so subjective. What is the true Deep Purple sound? But I think when you're saying only one lineup is valid, in effect, you're saying you know what the Deep Purple sound is. And I'm not sure anybody really does. Okay. Another sort of issue kind of related to the fourth one. If group identity is contingent on a particular sound, so let's assume we even can come to an agreement what the Deep Purple sound is, which I don't think we can, but let's say we could. How much can, say, Mark IV deviate from Mark II to still be legitimately called Deep Purple? So if we can agree on what the Deep Purple sound is, which again, I don't think we can, but let's say we could, well then, okay, so here's the Deep Purple sound. So how much can other lineups deviate from the Deep Purple sound to still be called Deep Purple? See what I'm saying? I think we have a problem with subjectivity here. I don't know how you could measure that, right? So I'm not sure, again, what's lacking here is objectivity, I think, in a lot of ways. And then finally, is it possible that it's just convenient, easy, okay, to hold the position that Mark II is the real Deep Purple? Admittedly, it does take considerable effort to appreciate all 7 variations of Deep Purple as we have them now. And not everyone is hardcore enough to invest the time, the energy, and the money into getting to know every lineup and understanding the music, which is totally fair enough. Like, I get that. Again, I don't want to come across as some music elitist here. I mean, if you're only interested in certain Deep Purple albums, cool, right? I have no problem with that. I'm not saying that you have to know every Deep Purple song inside and out, or you have no opinion. No, that, again, ludicrous. It would be crazy to say something like that. But I guess my point is it defendable to hold the position that the only authentic lineup is the one you are willing to spend the most time on, right? Again, whether people realize it or not, that's what I'm hearing when I hear a lot of these arguments. It's like, look, I don't really have time to dig into all the stuff Steve Morris has done with the band. Okay, fine. I have no issue with that. But then I'm not sure you have as strong a leg to stand on to say, but the only lineup that matters is Mark II anyway, right? Just because you haven't spent the time getting to know the other lineups, and if you don't want to, that's totally cool. But then I don't think you can say that they're somehow less valid simply because you don't want to spend the time listening to what they do, I guess is what I'm saying. All right. So therefore, Deep Purple represents an example of a group with interchangeable parts that has sparked all kinds of debate through time. And again, like I say, they're kind of the extreme example of, you know, hopefully I've outlined that reasonably clearly, that there's been so many lineup changes, but the Deep Purple name persists, and so many people have, you know, strong opinions on how valid it's been to keep the name through all these various lineups, and which lineups are more Deep Purple than others, and all that sort of thing, right? Led Zeppelin, on the other hand, was populated with the same people throughout its existence, except, of course, for Jason Bonham on just one night, leaving no lineup changes to compare and really no controversy, right? So Deep Purple has all this controversy. I mean, fun stuff to talk about, but a lot of controversy around the name. Zeppelin has none. I mean, ironically, the only controversy that Zeppelin has around, you know, is really that why didn't you carry on? Because we would love to hear another album or whatever kind of thing, right? All right. Most bands fall between these two extremes, right? And really the debate surrounding the name conundrum continues quite haphazard. Oh boy, I'm tripping over my words here. The debate surrounding the name issue continues quite haphazardly because of so much subjectivity. I think that's the essence of the problem here, right? That so much of this is subjective, and that's where I think a framework that adds a little objectivity to this might help the discussion become a little clearer. That's what I'm going to pursue in part 2 of this of these VideoTube presentations. So thank you for listening. Hopefully you'll check out part 2 and part 3 for that matter. And if you're inclined, please read the essay. And I would certainly be happy to hear any comments or read any comments that people might have. Thank you and take care.